word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
When talking about God, most people eventually get around to saying they're okay with the Christian New Testament God, but they have real problems with the God that they read about in the Hebrew Old Testament. The Old Testament God is perceived as violent, sometimes mean, and always jealous. And that God is simply not the kind of God that they want to worship. And I suspect many of us agree with that sentiment. We don't want to deal with a God that is often portrayed in the First Testament. We don't want to deal with a God that is sometimes violent, sometimes mean, and always jealous. Most of us prefer to think of God as the smiling, pleasant face of Jesus. We prefer to believe that God is a projection of our best human selves. We prefer a God who forgives us without first getting angry, jealous, or upset. Now, the image of a pleasant, best human kind of God emerged from a theologian, Ludwig Feuerbach, who wrote those words in the 19th century to describe the attitude most people had about God during that time. And I believe that viewpoint hasn't changed much in the 20th century. And today, well, most of us prefer to think about the God who embodies the best of all humankind has to offer. The problem is that image of God gives us two very different points of view about how to be followers of Jesus today. Either we come to the conclusion that God is active only through us, and that the idea is best conveyed in the statement that God has no hands but our hands, or we decide that God really has done all that needed to be done, that God is no longer active in public life today, that it's all about us. There's no more need for God to speak. There's no need for God to be actively involved in our lives. And both of those ideas present a God that's not involved in human life or human history. And those statements leave us essentially with a powerless and apathetic God. Which is one of the reasons why we need to spend time with the Hebrew Scriptures. For the entirety of the Old Testament talks about a God who is very powerful and extremely involved in human history. The whole of the Hebrew Scriptures portrays a God that is committed to holding humankind to our part of the covenant. God is willing to be our God, and our part of the covenant says that we will be God's people. Now that covenant has been challenged throughout the history of our human-God connection. God has always been faithful to us, but more often than not, humankind has been less than faithful to God. And it's more than likely people throughout human history became unfaithful to God in the same way we become unfaithful to God today. The people of Israel lived in Egypt for 400 years, and during that time, it's safe to say that they adopted the culture, the beliefs, and the behaviors of their captors. And no doubt, whether they meant to or not, the people came to view Pharaoh as godlike. He held the power of life and death over them. Bowing to Pharaoh and to his will were survival techniques. So in their lives, Pharaoh was God. In addition, the gods and the idols of Egypt, well, they were everywhere. And no doubt the Hebrew people learned to give them respect that looked a whole lot like worship. After all, the Egyptian gods seemed to be a whole lot more powerful than the God they had worshipped in Israel a very, very long time ago. Their memory of God was a distant memory. Their worship, their altars, and their beliefs had eroded mightily over those 20 generations spent in Egypt. As soon as the people were safely in Israeli territory at the foot of Mount Sinai, God spoke to remind them of what was most important. And the first thing God said was, "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and you shall have no other gods before me." God started that with that commandment because the other 9 work only if we are committed to listening to and living the first commandment. I am your God, and you are my people. And God was speaking to people who had lived the whole of their lives serving other gods. Pharaoh, Egyptian gods, the god of safety, the god of power, leisure, wealth. All the things they did not have were the gods that they had come to worship, the gods they had learned, to which they had learned to bow down, the gods that they wanted to possess. And throughout their journey to Mount Sinai, God had provided everything the people needed. God had proven again that God was their God. And now, God demanded their loyalty in return. God wanted the people to claim God as their only God, the only real power in their lives, the only power that mattered. God demanded they set aside every other god, every other power, every other desire they had, so that they could desire only the God of Israel. Without devotion and loyalty to God and God alone, things would go badly. They would forget to worship, they would forget to care for those dependent on them, and they would find it increasingly easy to kill, commit adultery, steal, and lie. Without putting God first, they would soon desire other things as much or more than the true living God of Israel. God was and is very clear. God expects to be in first place in our lives. God expects our loyalty, God expects our devotion, and when God doesn't get those things, everything else goes wrong very quickly. When we fail to be God's people, life becomes difficult. And like the people of Exodus, too often we forget to hold up our part of the covenant. Because, friends, we're surrounded by things. We're surrounded by people. We're surrounded by causes that want power over us, that want our loyalty, that want our devotion, that would even want our worship. They want to be first place in our lives. And we fool ourselves by saying those things aren't as important as God in our lives, but if we check, we might have to rethink that. If we look at how we spend our time, how we use our abilities, and how we use our money, well, it makes sense that God might wonder every now and then to what or to whom our true loyalty and our true devotion really goes. Because if we don't put God first in how we spend our time, if we don't put God first in how we use our abilities, and if we don't put God first in our giving, then God's not first in our lives. And everything else goes downhill very quickly. God in the Hebrew Scriptures is very clear. You will have no other gods before me. God demands our loyalty. God demands our worship. God demands that we hold up our end of the covenant to be God's people, and only God's people. So the question for us to ponder this morning, and perhaps for the next few days, the question for us to ponder is, where does God fit into our lives? How do we use our time to bring glory to God? How do we use our ability to serve God by serving God's people? Do we put God first in how we use our spending? Or do we find reasons to give to and think about and give our time and abilities to other things first? God expects and God demands first place. And there are a lot of people, there are a lot of voices, there are a lot of things that want our loyalty, our devotion, and our worship. But when we put God first, life and the rest of the commandments come a whole lot more easily. Amen.
Amen.
the opportunity to think right now about how we're using our time and our abilities, and who gets the first offering from our money. As the ushers wait upon us, let's spend time thinking about whether we put God first or if we're putting God in a different spot. Would the ushers please wait upon us?